Next up, chevron. This technique is similar to ori-nui in that you will be sewing through 2 layers of fabric along a folded line. However, you will not be using a running stitch. To complete this technique, start with your needle and thread just like you did with the previous 2 techniques. Fold along your guideline and pin your 2 layers of fabric together. Take your time and make sure you are pinning the correct parts of your fabric together. This stitch is a little tricky to follow, so it might be easier just for you to watch, but I like to think of it as a whip stitch. You are always going in one side of the fabric and out the other. I go through the front of my fabric and out the back. I bring my needle and thread over the top of the fold and then through the front of my fabric again. There will be a row of stitches sitting on top of the fold. You can see my stitches are a little inconsistent. I don't recommend sewing in the air like I am. Keeping your fabric on a solid surface might help with the consistency of your stitches, but if they aren't perfect, it's okay. I recommend only putting a couple stitches at a time on your needle and then pulling it through. This technique likes to get caught and bunched, so slowly working your way through it is ultimately less frustrating. And now we have 4 inches of chevron. And you can see that I'm keeping my knots on one side and tails on the other. Now we will move to the 4th stitch technique, Japanese larch. This larch stitch gets its name because the resist yields a concentric ring pattern, which looks like the rings of a tree. To start, fold the remaining part of your sampler in half. Like the 2 techniques before this one, we will be sewing through 2 layers of fabric. Make sure your fabric is smooth and there aren't any weird wrinkles between the 2 layers. You will now draw concentric half circles on your fabric. The halfway mark of the circle will line up with the fold of your fabric. Feel free to trace something. I didn't, and it was a little bit of a struggle. You do not have to have 3 circles across the width of your fabric. You could do 2 or even 1, but I do recommend doing at least 3 rings. They don't have to be exactly 1 inch apart, but these 3 rings will give you a better idea of the pattern that forms in this technique. Once your fabric is folded, pinned, and your circles are drawn, we will now do 3 rows of running stitches that connect our circles. The smallest circles will be connected, the middle row will be connected, and the largest circles will be connected. I like to work from the outside in. For the outermost circle, I actually wound up using a length of thread that was 4 times the width of my fabric, not 3 times the width. But the thread is then doubled up and knotted in the same way as before. Sew a running stitch through the 2 layers of fabric along the outermost half circle. Start on the same side as the rest of the sampler. I messed up a little bit here and I go back and correct myself, but you want to leave some loose threads between the circles. This thread gives you a place to pull and helps you gather your stitches later. Once you have reached the end, cut your 4 to 6 inch tail, and then move on to your second row of half circles, and then on to the innermost row. Your standard thread length of 3 times the width of your sampler is more than enough to finish these rows. Once you have completed these 3 rows, you have stitched your sampler. Overall, this took me about an hour from start to finish. I moved fast, I wasn't too precious with my stitches, and I have done this many times. If you want to make this same sampler, it might take you a little longer to complete. I would budget around 2 hours. The more time you take, the less likely you are to make mistakes, and you will ultimately be happier with your sampler. The next step is gathering. This is a very important step, as it is how you form the resist. You will gather your fabric along the lines you have stitched. The fabric creates a resist as it is folded up on itself. I start with the chevron stitch, as it is the most stubborn and tricky to move. Really take your time at this stage. It is very easy for your thread to snap under the strain and pull of gathering. It is very frustrating to snap your thread here because it means you have to go back and restitch. So slow down, take your time. This sampler took me about 10 minutes to gather. Once the top of the sampler is complete, move on to the Japanese larch. Start gathering this technique, one circle at a time, transferring the excess thread from one completed circle to the next. Once you have gathered all of your fabric, you can trim your thread ends back down to 4 to 6 inches. You will now go through and knot all of your ends. I find the easiest way to do this is to tie a square knot between 2 rows. So when you go to tie your knot, you should have 4 threads in your hand, 2 from row 1 and 2 from the other row. Make sure your knots and gathers are nice and snug. I am pulling kind of hard in this tutorial, but remember I am using a heavy coated upholstery thread. If you are using a standard sewing thread, I recommend being a little more gentle. Once your fabric is gathered and your knots are tied, your sample is ready for the dye bath. You can see how much our fabric has shrunk in this process.